So first of all, I want to thank you for coming here on a cold wintry night to hear what has to be one of the more dismal topics that could have been imagined. The phrasing of the title of this was not mine, though I think it's a good and important topic. But I have trouble imagining really anything more off-putting than coming out at night to hear about the dead and whether they can be harmed. So I'm very grateful that you've braved the weather and braved the title of the topic to do this. Grateful also, obviously, to the philosophy department and to Bob Please as chair for the invitation to speak about this tonight, and of course to Mr. Barry again. Thanks for thanks for the generosity to the department and for the faith and the trust in philosophy. I like to think that the title of the series, Public Philosophy, is not just a sort of cue to philosophers speaking here to leave at home the technical, scholarly apparatus of their articles to make it more palatable and interesting than something that might appear in Journal of Philosophy or Mind. I think it's also, the title Public Philosophy, a deeper reminder to us of in the West at least, of the original purpose of philosophy, which was in its Platonic form very much oriented towards helping human beings lead a good life and asking the questions that would be important to have answers to, and in order to do that, so that the public adjective, public philosophy, is not just forget the footnote sort of warning to people speaking from this podium, but in a way reminder of philosophy and one of its most worthwhile purposes. So I'm grateful for the reminder. So this is Plato. This could just as well stand over the whole series. And if the title of this talk, Can the Dead Be Harmed, is grim, this thought that all philosophy in one way or another is concerned with dying and being dead. Plato had a very particular meaning for that, but it seems particularly appropriate for this topic. So here we are, 2,500 and so years later. Here's Plato back there on some summer day in Piraeus or Athens and talking about this, and why, here we are. 2 millennia and a half, progress is slow. We cannot do philosophy and be impatient. So can the dead be harmed in 25 minutes or less? That's a tall order. In 2,500 years, we don't have a definitive answer to this. We have a question, a very good one. 25 minutes or less sounds daunting, but hopefully we can ask some questions and at least get some ideas on the ground about this. Okay, so I mean to begin with, the answer to the question, if you took the question on its own terms and at face value, the answer to the question, can the dead be harmed, is I think fairly incontrovertible and obvious. That is, no. That's like a minute and a half, and already we have the answer. But I'm ahead of myself here. So can the dead be harmed? I mean, the answer is, as I just said, no. As sentient beings, flesh and blood, possessing a consciousness, having plans for the future, able to feel pain and pleasure, all these things that human beings do and that can be harmed or improved by their own actions and the actions of those around them. I think outside of religious beliefs, and that's not a trivial outside, and I'm going to, for various sort of Rawlsian public purposes, bracket that here, mention it occasionally, but outside of theological arguments, the handfuls of dust that we're all fated to become are non-sentient, have no plans, no expectations, no hopes that can be thwarted or advanced, feel no pleasure or pain, and I don't see a way to interpret, to spin what we are as the dead that would allow us to speak of harm being done to that handful of dust. So it doesn't seem, on its face, it doesn't seem terribly fruitful to pursue the question, can the dead be harmed? So I just wanted to tweak it a bit in a way to include the dead, but to broaden it and to view the dead as one type of absence in a community, one form in which we encounter, one but not the only, form in which we encounter absence in our community. This also, serendipitously, is appropriate to this evening, right? So it's the first Seder of Passover, and in the Christian calendar, the beginning of Holy Week, so of the week leading up to Easter Sunday. Both Passover and Easter are celebrations of an absence and a presence coexisting simultaneously, both, but particularly speaking about the Seder being celebrated tonight, both easily see a continuity between presently existing flesh and blood human beings sitting around the Passover table and ancient Israel and its travails in the flight from Egypt. Both easily see the bitter herbs that they eat, the bitter herbs as a reminder, but more than a reminder, as a sort of making present of the servitude of ancient Israel. So it happens fortuitously, I didn't arrange the date for this either, but it happens fortuitously, serendipitously, as I said, that tonight when so many of our fellow citizens are celebrating a kind of presence and absence, that becomes our topic. So instead of speaking about the dead and whether they experience harm, I wanted to instead look at a community as a community we conventionally say arrayed across time. Communities have histories and they have futures. That's the conventional way we imagine it, in a sort of linear, chronological, time-based way. I want to suggest we just move that understanding a little bit and say that the communities we live in are communities of those tangible and present, us here in flesh and blood, endowed with voice, sentient, feeling pleasure and pain, having hopes and expectations, and all of the rest of the apparatus of daily human life. But in addition to that, we live in a community populated by absent persons. It's sort of the basis of ghost stories in a way, but the real sort of lived experience of these things. Well, who are these absent people? Probably easiest, most directly visible to us are the future absent. People who are not yet, and we don't know which ones, we can't individuate them, much less know what their preferences or thoughts or expectations will be. But we know that there will be future human beings, and we not only know that there will be, that these people absent now, that they will come into existence, but we feel a mesh of relations to them which are in some part, in some significant part, normative or moral in character. We owe them something. What do we owe them? They don't exist. They will exist, but they don't exist yet. What can we owe a non-existent person? What can we owe a cipher? Well, you think about what? You think about our environmental policies. You think about fiscal prudence, whether within a family or a state. Not spending your grandchildren's inheritance. Not polluting the globe now, because you know that there will be these future persons, absent now, who will have to live in this. So we have, in a whole array of our policies, from fiscal policy to national security to environmental policy, we take into account, as a moral presence among us, we take into account persons who do not exist, period. In the sense of the question, the dead, here, the non-born, however you want to term them, the non-born, we take them into account and treat them as claimants on us. We do not drive, lead-fueled cars now because in the future, after we're dead, somebody, not yet in existence, would have to breathe polluted air as a result of our actions. That constrains us in the present. So these absent figures aren't just Casper the Friendly Ghost, sort of little apparition, who appears, or a poltergeist who comes and disrupts, a wedding ceremony or something. These are people these are non-people, whatever the proper phrase, who make claims on us, who have a sort of moral, obligatory relationship to us, and we know when we violated it. Right? So the future, the absent who will be in the future, right, fairly obvious. There's another set of absent, that is, those who once were. Those people we can individuate. We know something about them. Once upon a time, they had a voice. They had a personality. We can individuate them, but they are well and truly absent. In relation to them, too, we have a kind of moral or obligatory relationship, different than we have to the future, but nevertheless a relation to, now literally, the dead, to the absent dead. What kind of moral relationship do we have to them? You run down the list of everyday behaviors associated with this. The duty to bury the dead, the duty to respect the physical remains of the dead, the duty to fulfill the will of the dead when they've left one. Right? In all of these circumstances, our thought is that the primary subject to whom we are obliged is a non-person, a dead person. That is, somebody who will not be harmed. So if I take my father's will, and instead of living up to its terms, I say I'd rather use his money and party. Well, let's imagine that there was no other beneficiary. You know, he wanted it, or, you know, potentially, so he wanted it, I don't know, give him to charity or something. So there's no individual attached to it. So I use it up. Right? Instead of doing the good he wanted done with it, I use it up. Well, in a sense, I think in an important sense, which I'll try to make clear near the end of my 25 minutes at this, we've harmed him. I've harmed him by it. Not some other, not some third party. The injury done by not fulfilling his stated and stipulated will is an injury to an absent person. And I suggest that is how we think of it. That if we watch some ne'er-do-well running off, you know, ignoring entirely the wishes of his parents as they pass on an inheritance to him, we understand that person to have injured not some bystander or third party, but primarily to have injured a relationship and a contract, so to speak, or an effective relationship with his parents. So on both sides of us then, when we sit here in our studies at home or look at the family photo album or do whatever we do, we as living sentient human beings are in the midst of a community of people who are absent. Our parents, our grandparents, our dead friends, our colleagues, right? Past philosophers, great musicians of the past, national heroes of our countries of citizenship. You can, I mean, the list can go on and on. And at the same time, we are surrounded, as we sit here living and right, with blood flowing through our veins, we are also surrounded by people future, who we don't know yet, but we do feel an obligation to them. I wanted to make this, I tried to think of a so you're going to have to forgive the cliche. I wanted to think of a non-cliched way to express this. I couldn't, but I found a very ordinary one that I think makes the point. So you imagine, I don't know, you know, an old grandparent, and she's sitting at her desk, and she's writing a will. She's writing a will for grandchildren who are not yet born, but she expects that they will be. So she's writing a will and passing on, in anticipation of her own death, passing on an inheritance to them. By her side on the desk is a picture of her own parents, now deceased. She sits there as plain as day. There's no particular theology that we need in order to understand what she's doing there, being a steward of the future, a custodian of the future, and a memorializer of the past with her parents' vote. There's nothing that seems wildly counterintuitive or mystical or Casper the Friendly Ghost about it. It is that we live in an extended community. We sometimes, as I said, speak about that in terms of time. But if we think about it more closely, it is that we're surrounded by non-persons, absents, who yet do have a sort of demanding moral claim on us. This is something of an oddity for reasons I'll come to in a moment. But I wanted to reformulate the question of this, can the dead be harmed, into a parallel question, and one I think that actually captures the underlying sort of issue here. And that is, what does it mean to have obligations or duties to non-persons, to persons who are absent but will be in the future, or to persons who were dead but were in the past, and in that past had some meaningful relationship to us. So it is, in a way, the question of the dead, but it broadens that category of dead, the ceasing of sentient physical life. It broadens that fact of death, our shared fate as human beings, into an absence which contains more, and I think allows us more possibilities for exploring these relationships than merely than insisting on speaking about the dead. Okay, so the question then is what does it mean to have obligations to persons who aren't present? It sounds like a sort of interesting intellectual puzzle that maybe professors spend way too much time on in their study and is worrying about. So I wanted to say a word about why it's important. I think in some ways it's deeply and transparently important. My particular interest is political philosophy, so I'll say a word about how it's important in that context, but then suggest some very everyday ways in which it has a similar, comparable importance. In political philosophy, it is particularly poignant and particularly important for thinking about historic injustice. How do we as a society address historic injustice? Whether that is slavery in this country, the period of segregation, whether that is the Holocaust, you range across the examples of areas in which we need to think about historic injustice and how we respond to it. There are more than a couple, so there are a bunch, but I'll pick out a sort of class of them. Some ways of responding to historic injustice essentially involve addressing the present and future. There is no, for people who see the matter that way, there is no relevant way of addressing the past for precisely the reasons we stated at the beginning of this talk. The past is populated by the dead, people who can neither be punished nor rewarded, their fate, their victimization, incurable and beyond our hands to reach. But, on this view, we can do something to the present, downstream, inheritors of those wrongs. We can, invoking, slogans like never again, we can look to a future and try to avoid a repetition. The time register is always present or future. I'd suggest that a large part of the reason that answering historic injustice is located in present and future is because, though we have no trouble thinking about our own individual, private, familial debts to the past, somehow at the political level this seems way too odd a move, right? So it's not part of the story. So thinking about what it means to do justice to the past is in part thinking about what it means to do justice to people who were absent. Are they still claimants on us? Are the victims of slavery or political violence or mass violations of human rights in places like Argentina or Central America or elsewhere? Are those people now dead? Do they remain claimants on us such that if we fail, right, such that if we fail to do justice to the crimes committed against them, fail to make an adequate social or public response to it, that we somehow or other have harmed them? So at the political level, it has, I think, a fairly clear importance, even more so, and for reasons I've already sort of ventured, even more so at the personal level. How does it matter? It matters in the sense of, why do we bury people? Why do we consider the taking of body parts as trophies in time of war to be an abomination? Why? The person's dead. What does it matter to give them a burial? What does it matter to show my daughter, pictures of her dead grandparents? Why does that matter? They're dead, they're gone, they're dust, they're sentient, no harm is done them. It only matters for the future and present, if that, right? But it doesn't, and we know that. And when we do these things, and maybe even sometimes when we have little conversations with the dead, when we, turn and just say, Dad, you'd really be proud of what your granddaughter did today. I think probably most of us had that experience and don't doubt for a moment that in a sense, that grandfather is still part of this community, just like the grandmother we described with the picture of her parents on her desk, understands that there is a presence there. It's not this presence, it's not flesh and blood and eyes and ears to hear, but a kind of moral presence in the community that makes that grandparent a part of the success of her granddaughter in the present. So I think at a whole variety of levels, if we lived in a universe which shared that answer that I gave at the outset, no, of course the dead can't be harmed. Right? They were flesh and blood, now they're dust. End of story. This would not be the world in which we live. It would not be, right, the morals that we have, the passion, the affective dispositions towards the dead that we have. So it has trying to understand what that claim means. The idea that we have debts to, and in having debts to, therefore we can harm absent persons, is something we need to try to think about, and all the more so since we hold very easily the contrary thesis. We live in a world, as we'll see in a moment, of both theses. We live in a world in which the dead really are the dead, and apart from faith traditions, that for most of us is that is an absolutely true proposition. Those dead are no longer sentient, they're gone, they're dust. But yet we talk to them, worry about how their bodies will be disposed, execute their wills faithfully, memorialize them, show their photographs around, build memorials to them. Right, in the reflective pool at the 9/11 site, we inscribed their names. At the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the same. Right, Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah begins with the quote from Isaiah, "I will give them an eternal name." Regular part of our. So somehow or other we live between both, and so we need to ask. Okay, so first then, so I want to set out an argument very briefly for each of the two legs of that proposition. So first, that the absent dead cannot be harmed because they no longer exist. They are simply dead and gone, and that's the end of that story. And then I'll do a comparable, very brief little run through the argument that they can be harmed, and then suggest finally an alternative way of looking at this. So this is the outline. I've just outlined it for you. So here are two quotes, one from the famous American social theorist Clint Eastwood from his film The Unforgiven, and the other from mid-20th century German philosopher Max Horkheimer. This is a letter to his fellow German philosopher Walter Benjamin. Okay, so the Eastwood one first. So this is the character who's sort of a bounty hunter, goes around killing people, and he says to this young sort of would-be bounty hunter, he says, well, it's a hell of a thing killing a man. Take away all he's got and all he's ever going to have. You know, so if you take that, to kill, that to make a person dead is to take away everything that they have, but not only that, everything that they would be. And what's left? What's left is a handful of dust, and that is the. So for Eastwood, the drama of being a bounty hunter or killing people is that it goes, in a sense, beyond any conventional kind of injury to rob them both of their past and their future. Max Horkheimer picks up the, interestingly, roughly the same thing. Past is a loose translation, but he says past injustice is done and over with. Those killed are really killed. That's how bluntly it ends. Those killed are killed. Addressing past injustice as past injustice, rather than as a precursor to some present injustice or as some warning bell for possible future injustices, to address past injustice as past, according to Horkheimer here, is impossible because the killed are really killed. The killed are dead. One might wish that they could come back, find their day in court, appear as ghosts to haunt those who've tormented them. But again, outside of certain traditions, this isn't the way it is. Okay, and so on the side of the argument that the dead can be harmed, just to show you that this isn't all isolated in religious thinking. So that Aristotle, that Plato passage that I just cited from the Phaedo, it's in the context of Socrates considering what he calls the greatest blessings in that other land, meaning after death. So he's thinking about what death will be like, what kind of blessings there will be. And he has a very particular and markedly sort of Socratic sense of what liberation from our earthly bodies will be like and all the benefits that await. You see a popularized version of that same claim at the end of the Apology, Plato's Apology of Socrates, where Socrates, after having been given the death sentence, the cup of, ordered to drink the cup of hemlock, speculates on what he might find in Hades, and without stumbling over a single word, just launches into a description of what Hades might be like. He also says he can't be absolutely sure, but he says it's likely to be populated by people like Homer, so it'll be a whole lot of fun to go down there and question them, just as he's questioned all these people in Athens. But in Plato's case, I mean, clearly whatever else one might say about him, no thinker deeply wedded to any particular ancient theological commitment that I can see in his writings, easily, seamlessly makes that transition into thinking about death. His great student Aristotle, so again 4th century roughly BC, in his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics speculates that the dead's happiness can be affected by the fate of the people they live on this earth. He makes that argument, never judge a life right until it's complete, but it turns out it's never really complete, because after they die, they can still be affected by what goes on here. He makes that argument, again, a person in no obvious way, indeed, in no way, period, that I can imagine, theological in character, seamlessly just glides into that speculation about a life after death in which he says the dead can be hurt, right? They can suffer as a consequence of what's happening to their living descendants. Immanuel Kant, great Prussian philosopher, one of the central figures of the European Enlightenment. Kant, not in the groundwork of Metaphysics of Morals, but in a more mature text, Metaphysics of Morals, partially same title. Kant in that text makes a clear and lengthy argument that the dead can be harmed by the actions of the present. In Kant's case, an entire theory of the human subject, the human personality as free rational agency, is deployed to say that we aren't primarily sensory beings, flesh and blood, nerve endings, passions, right, pleasure and pain. We are what he used the term noumena. We are, in a sense, these pure rational creatures, and that part of us survives, Kant thought. So here it's a man who was censured by the Prussian state for atheism, so whatever one might say about Kant, theological, is probably not going to be a correct description of his writings. For Kant too, it seemed fairly obvious that the dead were out there, and that to slander the dead was not just to be rude, but to harm them. Okay, so we have two legs of this, one which denies absolutely the presence of the dead as a moral fact, the other of which seems quite comfortable asserting it. Hence the conundrum. I promised Bob I wouldn't read, but I will read one sentence to you. Okay, so this is Alex. This is Axel Honneth, contemporary German philosopher speaking. Honneth writes that we are all now naturalists with respect to death and absence. Quote, we have become complete naturalists in relation to the dead. All see, and he means including believers, all see death as the definitive final end. Axel Honneth goes on from that to say this is a little bit puzzling, because the very same people who are absolute naturalists with regard to death are the very same ones you can catch sometimes at their desk looking at the picture of a deceased relative and telling them the news of the day, or visiting their parents' grave, or going to the memorial of their comrades killed in war. And they find this sort of duality in their lives completely unproblematic. So Honneth goes on to offer a sort of anthropology, a kind of philosophical anthropology, in which modern human beings share both in this belief in absence, a kind of belief in ghosts, and yet are naturalists with regard to the human body and its ultimate demise. So that's the core conundrum. I want to suggest a slightly different way of thinking about this, related to the idea of of a community as a community of the present and absence of us living in the present and those to come and those who have been, and see if we can't get at least some understanding, not a resolution of the conundrum that Honneth sets out for us, but maybe a way of thinking ourselves into it. This is a very famous quote used for a whole variety of purposes in political philosophy. It's a quote from Aristotle's Politics. And so Aristotle here says, the person who is without a city through nature is as if he were an isolated piece in a game of chess. They didn't actually have chess then. We don't know quite what game Aristotle is referring to. But the term that he uses in Greek here is unyoked. So an isolated person is a person unyoked. So if you sort of flip that Aristotelian proposition, make it positive, it means that there's something characteristic about human beings, that they are yoked in or tethered in a mesh of relationships to each other, and not only to each other as living, embodied, sentient human beings, but to their future human beings and their dead past. So that to be a human being then is to have these relationships, and these relationships for Aristotle were not just sort of empirical facts about the world that were citizens or family members or spouses or members of professional associations. These relationships are also heavily loaded with moral norms, with obligations and responsibilities that come from being tethered or yoked in that kind of way. So the responsibility of citizens to commemorate their patriot dead, the responsibility of citizens to worry about future generations, the comparable, at a smaller scale, responsibilities of family members, all these are part of being tethered in the way that Aristotle is speaking about here. So that to be yoked, right, to be that in that characteristically human environment of relationships, is to have not just, why would we imagine, to have just relationships with other people whose flesh we can squeeze and who blush and who are breathing? Why would we think just them? In fact, we don't think just them. I have a relationship to my parents. They're gone, but I have a relationship to them. I think probably most of us understand and accept that there are such things, and that entirely outside of any theological context which would give it a kind of meaning by speaking to the soul of persons, or other arguments which would allow for a continuation, sort of visible, tangible continuation of the person. Okay, that's Aristotle and that sort of big ancient Greek philosophy. I wanted to bring it to a level that to a place that we can see more in our daily lives and the sort of abstractions that Aristotle in that passage we just quoted is setting out. This is a quote that I wanted to share with you from a French 20th century novelist, one of the great sort of experimental novelists of the post-World War II French literary world, Georges Perec. This is a sort of quasi-autobiographical piece. It's drawn from called W, or Remembrances or Souvenirs of Childhood. So Perec came from a Polish-Jewish family that had fled before the outbreak of World War II to France and found themselves there when the Germans invaded in the early 1940s. His mother was, he was a child at this time. His mother was deported to Auschwitz and was murdered there, and his father was killed in action serving with the French army during the invasion. So here Perec is writing about his relationship to them and what sort of effect that has for the present. So he says, I write. So that's what he is. He's a writer. So he says, I write because we live together, because I was one among them. This is an expression of tethering or yoking, right? Because I was one among them, shadow in the midst of their shadows, body next to their bodies. I write because they left in me their indelible mark, and the trace of that is what is written. Right? So so there's a present tense obligation there. I write. It's not past. I write. But I write because now it shifts to past tense. Right? Because I was one among them, shadow among their shadows, body next to their bodies. right? That relationship, you might think, is therefore, because the parents are dead, among other things, and because chronologically it's situated in the past, that relationship has ceased. But what he expresses here is the sense in which it hasn't ceased at all. He writes now in the present day, March 25th, he doesn't, he's passed away too, March 25th, 2013, there's somebody else out there like him who writes because there is this relationship with the dead which imposes this obligation on him. So it is what Perec captures here is that connection between having a relationship, in this case nothing fancier than a child-parent relationship, between having that relationship and that relationship enduring past the death of one of the parties. The relationship doesn't die. His parents died. The relationship doesn't die. And the obligation that relation creates, the indelible mark as he calls it, that it leaves on him, also doesn't pass away. He doesn't deny, in this passage, he does not deny for a second that his parents are dead. There's no sense that they are some kind of supernatural being speaking to him and telling him, go ahead, George, right. It's not that. It is an obligation that he owes because of a relationship that he had with them, but had isn't quite the right verb tense. Had and continues to have. They did not cease to be his parents when they died. That relationship doesn't go away. One of the parties to it loses that part of them which is their flesh and blood, their sentient, that part which can be physically harmed or rewarded or improved. But the relationship between this person, this individual living in the present, George Perec, and his dead parents, that relationship doesn't go away because of their death. It remains, in a very strong sense, real sense for him, binding on him. I wanted to finally give so this summarizes it very nicely, actually. The words aren't mine, I wish they were. The ties of affection and friendship. So this is that relationship between tethering and continuance of subjects, even if they're no longer sentient flesh and blood subjects. The ties of affection and friendship which knit us as one throughout our lives, one can imagine Perec saying this, do not unravel with death. They do not cease to be my parents because they're dead. The duty to honor them, to respect them, to memorialize them, to transmit knowledge of them to my daughter endures. Right? It doesn't die, they do. So the relationship in that way becomes a vehicle for these ongoing obligations across time and becomes a sense in which the dead are never entirely actually absent, but continue to interact with us not as full persons, right? Not with flesh and blood. They don't do that. We can't lean over and ask the dead what they think or what they would want us to do. Ask them to loan us some money. They won't do stuff like that. But they are there, and our parents, and the relationship duties, the relational duties that were part of our relationship do not perish with their physicality. And that's captured nicely in this and in the Perec comment. So I wanted, I don't know if you can see that, to show now, since I'm primarily interested in political philosophy, to show this. I'm sorry this is a miserable screen grab, but it's the screenshot, whatever they're called. But it's the best I could do. This is a page it's bilingual, but it originates in Argentina, and it is a memory wall for the dead of the Dirty War, which ran roughly 1976, 1982 in Argentina. The dirty part of the Dirty War, assuming that there's such a thing as a clean war and one without tremendous moral ambiguity. The dirty part of the Dirty War was the torture, execution, and then in that awful neologism, the disappearing of, by and large, opposition members, not armed insurgents, not combatants, but members of student organizations, people active in various left political parties, some 30,000 of them, tortured, killed, and then their bodies dispersed in ways to make it near to impossible for them to actually be recovered. So in the aftermath of the dictatorship, when it fell in 1982, Argentinians began to set up these memorials, and the mothers of the Plaza del Mayo, right, who still parade. If you go to Buenos Aires, they're still there demanding information on the disappeared. So these are the disappeared. Very appropriate term for this discussion. They disappeared the first and most radical time when they died. They disappeared a second time when their earthly remains were concealed, dumped into the Atlantic from helicopters, a whole variety of other ways in which whatever remained of them in death was gotten rid of. The fact that they're disappeared, dead, and even their earthly remains missing, the fact that they're disappeared, far from making them absent, far from turning them into a nullity, something to be forgotten, ignored, what are they to us? In fact, has, if anything, fueled a massive 2 decades long now movement to try to have them restored. You'll notice that at the very top of this page is the statement present. It means these disappeared are present. They're not absent. They're present. To say that they're disappeared, to take that first answer to the question, can the dead be harmed? To say that they're dead, nothing more can be done to them. Spilled milk, water, all these euphemisms we have. Spilled milk, water under the bridge. Let bygones be bygones. They're dead after all. They're not going to feel any worse if we forget them. Take down this silly memorial wall. What is that about? It's living in the past. It's picking its scabs. Would we really say that that is the right comportment? I think we'd probably be much more inclined to say that the statement at the top of the page, that they're present, is true and accurate. Not just present, but present in a particular obliging way, that we need to do them the justice of determining what happened to them, and if we can catch any living perpetrators who did these terrible things, that they should have their day in court, their day to confront, right, these absent presences who are the victims of the disappearing policy. One thing to see in this, it is not an odd sort of supernatural presence that's being referred to at the top here. They are present in a very particular way to their fellow Argentinians, their fellow citizens, maybe to others as well, but to their fellow Argentinian citizens, they are present as citizens and subjects of justice. The faces that you see here, the smiles, the histories, what it is that they wanted out of life, what year they were in college when they were abducted by the security services, these things are really and truly dead and gone. They belong to that realm that never could be restored, in which that individual now no longer exists. But as a subject of justice, a claimant, answer us, right? Find who did this. They are indeed present. Right? So we don't need any quasi-magical thinking here about their return to us and all their youthful vigor from the late 1970s. We don't have to imagine anything like that. We also don't have to imagine we don't have to accept any religious notion of transcendence. We don't have to imagine that their souls are somewhere and come back to haunt us. We can, but we don't have to do that. We have to say that we were tethered to them. We had a relationship to them. We were, in that Aristotelian phrase, yoked to them as citizens, members of a shared community of justice. And in that respect, they endure in the same way our parents do in relation to us, not as talking, laughing, crying human beings, but as our parents. That relationship to them as subjects of justice endures, and that is why, to repeat one of the elements of the importance of the question, that's why we feel a kind of duty to answer them, put their tormentors in the docket, memorialize them, write about them, speak about them, put their photos up on the web. So that's I don't know if that was 25, I'm afraid it was more than 25 minutes, oh darn well. So anyhow, that's the closest I can come to making sense of that tension that Honneth identified between the naturalists that we all are about our own embodied persons and the ease with which we sit there in the midst of the absent and understand that they are always there with us and have a certain very limited but nevertheless important kind of presence. Thank you. Questions? No? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for asking that. Yeah. Yes, you know, there are two ways you could imagine that tetheredness going, and I chose the phrase tethering because it also has a sort of, it means being tied to. So ancient Greek tragedy classical Greek tragedy is full of the dead coming back to persecute, torment, you know, to govern the lives of the present generation. So the question that emerges, is there a way to be tethered where finally that dead is quitted? Where finally they, in a sense, it's now metaphorical sense, but they, in a sense, go off, or at peace, now can, in a sense, become truly the dust and nothing that is their current condition. Stopping, and I think in a way the answer, it's a tough one. I mean, there are a number of. I'm trying to think of the best way to. It's such a provocative, good point. In one way, I think for people who had a relationship to them, let's say of a familial or personal kind, probably that relation is severed only with the death of the living party, the one at that end of the tether or yoke. So it only ends with the death of both parties. Until then, it endures. My parents are my parents until I can no longer speak of myself as aware of anything in death, and so then it disappears. In the political case, so in this, in the disappeared in Argentina, you might say that the tethering ends when justice is done. When finally they are, if not physically found, their bodies physically found, when finally the public, the state, society says this crime happened to you, then you can say their tethered presence, their sort of demanding tethered presence, which you see in that memory wall page. They're not just photos there. Those aren't just faces or past histories. Those are people who were saying, do something about. I mean, they're there, and their presence is an obligatory presence. Once that obligatory presence is acquitted, then you could imagine that relationship in justice. They will always be our fellow citizens who were unjustly killed, but their do this, demanding presence, I would imagine ceases. Hence, one of the great imperatives to do them justice is that it puts the past to rest. Can I give you just a very brief example, though, from something that I think we'll all be, either familiar with personally or familiar with through literature or film. Great film called Truly, Madly, Deeply. It's actually not such a great, it's an okay film. Truly, Madly, Deeply. It's about a couple and the husband, they're both fairly young, and the husband dies way untimely, way premature, I forget what it is, nothing, no crime or anything, he has a heart attack or something, and passes away. She then has to do what people in that position do. Think of her present and future. Is she going to get married? Will she have another relationship again? Well, doesn't it turn out that he comes back as a ghost? But this is what's his name? Kevin Costner, sort of around the pottery wheel nonsense. Is he comes back and he wants that relationship back. Right? So that's what he's insisting on. She can't leave him. They had this relationship. It was not ended willfully or intentionally by either of them. So he wants that relationship back. She finally falls in love with somebody else and says to him that their relationship now is past. They are untethered. And that's what it takes. And it's not made out to be, it's a British film. It's not made out to be in a sort of Hollywood way, an easy, see you later, it was fun while it lasted sort of thing. It's deeply traumatic because it is the severing of a relationship with a dead person, incredibly, but a relationship. And for her to, quote unquote, move on, to take on a new relationship now with a living present person involves you know, an ending of that one or a severing of its ties. And so, you know, and we can see that we don't need to look to criminal courts in Buenos Aires to see that these absent persons can be there as demanders on us, as subjects of justice, right, demanding to be requited for the injustices they suffered. But we can see it in, you know, in the much more intimate venues of our personal lives. And anybody who's known a spouse or a friend who's lost a friend, I mean, knows that there's always that sort of inkling of betrayal if you do move on, if you do, you know, remarry or find another relationship that's important to you. It's why that feeling of betrayal? Because you remain in a relationship with that absent person, and to move on, quote unquote, means in a way severing it. So, you know, so the sort of clean, hopeful, you know, America 2013 answer is, of course we can move on. We're a people of the present and future. Of course we can move on. The reality is that moving on sometimes involves, you know, severing relationships, most obviously relationships with living people, but also relationships with absent people. And, you know, so eventually, in those courtrooms, you know, in the Nurembergs or the Jerusalem courtrooms or the courtrooms in Buenos Aires, eventually the courts draw a line. Eventually there is an end. There's a decision. There's an execution or a prison sentence or an acquittal or whatever it is. There's an end. And the relatives are left with the ongoing, the relatives of the victim then are left with the ongoing pain of a relationship that for them is never ended until their own deaths. They leave the courtroom with its final line drawn, and their pain hasn't ended because their relationship hasn't ended. But in that courtroom, as citizen speaking to citizen, dead citizen to living citizen, when the court passes its sentence, that's the time for the dead end of the tether, in a sense, to, you know, do what happens in Truly, Madly, Deeply, to now be silent, and they have their measure of justice, and there are no more claims they can make. So it isn't endless. So maybe Greek tragedy was, in one of its rare instances, wrong in that. I don't know who's... Okay, so, and there's a question behind you, too, I think. Okay. So that means, I think that means, yes, members of the public. The woman with the hat on then. You're not a member of the public?
Okay. So I'm wondering about the implications of the argument for people who are absent in our communities but alive.
Yeah.
And if there's a way in which there are people who have moral obligations who fall outside of our awareness.
Right.
But are not there.
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. And you know, part of Axel Honneth's, I mean, Honneth's work, which is on identity and recognition. You know, one of the reasons that he's drawn to that topic is precisely that issue. Recognition is sort of recognition owed to the absent dead. And so, yeah, that's absolutely right. Absence isn't only, right, past and future, so the dead and the not yet born. It is also the absent, right, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man that Professor Outlaw first introduced to me, that in The Invisible Man you see in a way a sort of living absence, somebody, you know, in a sense constantly overlooked. And so absolutely, and so in treating of, in looking at the question of absence, it isn't just the dead and the unborn who populate that world, but it is the certainty that, you know, that around us are those at the, right, are those who were made invisible. They aren't themselves invisible, but they're made invisible. And so the process of, you know, the activity of recognition, right, such an important moral imperative, the process of recognition is, in a sense, as in that Argentinian memory wall, a recognition of the dead whose presence the military authorities sought to obliterate entirely. In thinking about future policies, it is to make present, to use our voice to make present subjects who do not now exist, but we know will. in the case of the invisible, those among us who were rendered invisible, it is that act of politics, of the making visible of them. But it's important to see the commonality there too. In a sense, all are absent, though the absent among us have a distinctive kind of absence in the sense that it is directly an artifact of oppression, of what's done in the here and now, whereas the dead, their absence seems to have some other naturalistic sort of, dead because, well, I mean, some of them are dead because they've been persecuted, they're disappeared, but in the ordinary course of things, their absence seems to have seems to be free of the same kind of oppressive features that they live in, absent. But that's absolutely right. So if one wanted to write absence and, an account of absence and recognition, it would most surely have to include those who, for other reasons, are absent among us. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 Right. Right. Yeah. 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 Right. It could. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm intensely. That's very, very nicely put. And yeah. I mean, so. I mean, you could say that arguments like this, how do we make sense of our intuitions that the absent matter in some morally obligatory, indeed often in some costly way to us? We sacrifice for the sake of the not yet born. So why do we do that? And then we offer a sort of quasi-Kantian transcendental deduction, because we can only make sense of that experience if we assume that there is some, not an illusion that we have, it isn't an optic thing, it is the real presence, so to speak, of the dead in this way, in this yoked or relational way. Right. In the absence of, that's right, I mean, that Kantian argument, in the absence of a better explanation of the phenomena, we, for regulative purposes, that is to make a kind of coherent sense of our experience, we allow that this must be, or this is the closest, like teleological explanation in nature, which was one of Kant's favorite examples. Like that, we adopt as a regulative principle a teleological explanation of nature, always holding open the possibility, Kant thought, that eventually there will be a mechanical causal explanation. So we have it's always held as a conditional mode of explanation. It could well be. It could also be, even more so, following your excellent point, to a more brutal conclusion, is that we live, or we, the sort of grand we in this part of the world live in the penumbra of religious communities and faith traditions, which, for very explicit and strong and long enduring theological reasons, absolutely saw the dead as present. Right? So Catholic funeral masses, I mean, address the dead by name. That quote I gave after the Aristotle one, that what knits us in friendship and affection in the present is not unraveled with death, is actually a quote from the Catholic, not the funeral rite, but the wake, the vigil, what they call it, right? The vigil rite, so the ceremony before the actual funeral. And it can be entirely secularized, which I did for purposes here, and just said that's what a relationship is. Our relationships of friendship don't cease with death. They don't unravel because the person dies. They endure, and hence the importance of, hence the reality of grief and long-standing grief and sense of loss that follows these things, okay? So you could say maybe what we're seeing here, all these intuitions that Booth spoke about are, really at the end of the day, the penumbra, the outer edge of a shadow cast over, from 2,000 years of religious history. We don't live in that world of the common prayer book of 1500s anymore. We don't go up at the gravesite and address the person by name as he's lowered into the grave, or dirt is cast on his, is thrown on his coffin. We don't do that, but the sort of lingering, the penumbral sense, to put it that way, maybe a kind of vestigial thing, a kind of reflex that we, obviously I don't think so, or I wouldn't have said, I wouldn't have made these arguments. I think we can come very close to, sort of Kantian regulative explanation, but an explanation that can be largely secular in character, so not invoking any particular theological tradition, but that evokes an understanding of relationships that has a certain power to it, right? And makes sense of our experience, and so, though far from exhaustive or perfect, it brings us closer to understanding that world that Honneth described, in which we're solid, 100% dyed in the wool, materialists about our own body and the meaning of death, and at the same time know just why my granddaughter has to be told all about her grandmother, why my daughter has to be told about her grandmother, because it would be forgetting my mother if I didn't, and in forgetting my mother I'd be doing a wrong, and and I mean, it would be just to try, as I said a number of times, I don't want to beat the same drum constantly, but to try to imagine the advocacy, the recommending of a different mode of relating. What do their bodies matter? Why bury them? Who cares? Fertilizer, all of them. What is it? What's wrong with taking the ear of a dead and putting it on a necklace and wearing it around? What is wrong with? I mean, to just imagine a universe in which those tethered relationships to the absent aren't part of what we do would be to imagine a very different place than the one we live in, though, as you absolutely correctly said, that, even if all of that was assumed to be a credible, so everything I said was assumed to be credible, which I put a question mark over, it would, at the end of the day, be, as you also absolutely correctly said, more of a regulative idea, something that we need to save the phenomena. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and there are. I didn't want to use even more than 25 minutes. I did actually use, but there are. Just purely, so having no theological content, Joel Feinberg, so that the injury done is an injury to an ante-mortem, to a pre-death person, so that the kind of slander, so I die and somebody writes horrible lies in a book that savages my reputation, and everybody thinks that James Booth was a scoundrel thereafter, that in Feinberg's account, and this is this is legal, rigorous, non-theological in any sense. Feinberg's account is that the injury is done to an ante-mortem person. So it's my interest as a living person to have my good name in perpetuity intact, so that generation after generation will know, aha, James Booth, a good soul, right? Him. So when after my death they do this, they don't, for Feinberg, they don't injure my post-death, my post-mortem person. There is nothing there to injure. What they injure is the interests and wishes that I had ante-mortem. This, needless to say, that sort of claim, with all of its sort of unusual causal directions, poses its own set of thorny difficulties, but it allows us a way to think about injury after death without either the sort of transcendental deduction of grief, a la Booth, or kind of concessionary regulative idea, sort of chickening out. Well, we call it I can't say, I can't prove to you that freedom exists. So instead I'll say that freedom is a precondition of experiences I know I have, including moral judgments. Can't really say any more about it, but that's the best defense. I mean, this starts to look, well, so. Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a, I mean, not in the literal sense, but maybe in this sense. I'm sorry to be reaching for another Hollywood illustration or getting tired of them, and you can certainly tell what bad movies I watch from this. Saving Private Ryan, right? So Private Ryan, who you see in the opening scene, so Private Ryan who survives the war and goes back to the military cemetery in Normandy, and there, I forgot the Tom Hanks character, the one who saves him but is killed. So it's like the Tom Hanks character tells him at the point of death, says, "Earn this." Remember that line? I think he's dying there, and in one of these Hollywood death scenes, he finds the presence of mind to turn to Ryan and say, earn this or deserve it or something. And so for the rest of this guy's life, he has this doppelganger. He has this sort of fellow walker through his life, who's the person who saved him, and keeps sort of nudging him on, earn it. Your survival cost my life, so I gave my future for the sake of your present. Now earn it. It's not your classical doppelganger, but it has that effect of a sort of a moral partner in life and a kind of indebtedness. So when he sort of kneels down at the tomb in the cemetery in Saint-Laurent in Normandy, when he kneels down at the Tom Hanks, the real person presumably's tomb, and says, I did it. I earned this. It is the real quitting of a debt, and he has had this sort of debt ledger and this debt keeper as his partner in life. I think that too, that rings, I hate to invoke intuition again now, having heard all the absolutely correct cautionary notes about relying on it too much, but it sounds, it sounds right. Interestingly, it's the sort of thing written by the living on military tombstones, not by the dead, who of course don't get to write anything usually about their own death, but these military tombstones, which Americans are not allowed to do, interestingly, by law, are not allowed to do this, but in the British Commonwealth they do, there will be these invocations to the living. So passerby, remember me at the British military cemetery in Kohima in India, which was a tennis ground that the British defended. There's a sign that says, the line I just used, "We gave our futures for your present, remember us." Sort of, an enactment, and it is an enactment, it's not the dead speaking, but the living giving voice to the dead and making the dead then, in a sense, co-owners of our present. And in that way, so it's a very nice point you made. In that way, like a doppelganger, they become, probably often in an irksome way, they become sort of our partners in this. Yeah, that's right. I mean, in that sort of archaeology of human communities and the relationships, the tethered relationships that compose them, the relationships of debt, of obligation are deep and pervasive. We trivialize that a lot. We have Memorial Day or, veterans parades, which are occasions for people to go shopping and get good sale prices at Walmart or whatever. We trivialize it, but the underlying thought and inspiration in these things, reflects, I think, a deep recognition of the sort of tectonic plates of society, that its moral debts and its relationships or not only amongst those in this room with blood still flowing in their veins, but also with, you know, with others who, you know, so it, yeah. Jerry Falwell? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. You know. Right. Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah, good. And you know what Lucius Outlaw, I mean, you know, Lucius taught me this actually in that same seminar where he introduced Ellison. I mean, is the political dimension of memory. It is a temptation, and one to which I have and continue to succumb, to speak in almost, I don't know what the name for the voice would be, but where memory and remembrance take on an almost sacred, untouchable. We don't want to dirty that with politics. This is pure and pristine indebtedness. Don't dirty it with, you know. But one of the things, if you don't mind me summarizing what you said years ago, I mean, one of the things that was pointed out is that, I mean, is that memory and its politics are as pervasive and deep and contested as the politics of anything else we do in common. There's no sort of non-political, extra-political sanctuary from our disputes where we find a sort of glowing remembrance in which we all, I mean, the memory activists will make it out that way. We can't possibly say anything wrong about this or that, because then we dirty the memory of, right, we besmirch the memory of. It's a very good warning to watch out for that sacralization, you might say, of memory, and accept that in democratic society, probably in all societies, but certainly in democratic ones, we fight, we argue, we contest who's going to be remembered and how and by whom, and you know, no doubt 1,000 other questions that make this as live and as hot a debate, right, when it's sparked as any we might have. And Larry's waiting. Okay. Thank you very much for all your great questions.